There is a strange kind of silence that does not arrive with noise, but instead replaces it. It does not announce itself with collapse or destruction. It simply appears quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a familiar voice that slowly fades until one day you realize it is no longer there. If you look deep into the earliest records of human civilization, there is a recurring pattern that feels almost too subtle to detect at first glance. The earliest writings, carved into stone and pressed into clay, do not describe a distant or abstract force. They describe presence, something close, something involved. Something that did not just observe humanity, but interacted with it, shaped it, and guided it in ways that now feel difficult to fully grasp. And yet, somewhere within those same records, something begins to change. Not suddenly, not violently. There is no clear line that marks the moment of departure. No single event that declares, this is when it ended. Instead, the shift feels gradual, almost hesitant, as if whatever once existed began to step back, little by little, until its absence became more noticeable than its presence ever was. At first, it appears as a slight distance in the tone of the writings. Descriptions that once felt immediate begin to feel remembered. Interactions that once seemed direct begin to sound like echoes of something that had already passed. The language does not panic. It does not question. It simply adapts, as if the people writing these words were witnessing a change they did not fully understand, but slowly accepted. And that is where the silence begins to take shape. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that used to be there. A silence that carries weight, even without explanation. A silence that does not answer questions, but instead creates them. What makes this moment so difficult to define is that nothing appears to break. Civilizations continue. Cities expand. Systems remain intact. Life does not collapse under the absence. Instead, it continues forward, as if guided by something that is no longer present. And that raises a question that does not easily settle. If something had truly been there, something capable of shaping early humanity so deeply, then how could it simply be gone, without leaving behind a clear trace of its departure? Or perhaps it did leave a trace, not in the form of destruction or endings, but in the form of a quiet shift, a subtle transformation in the way humans began to see the world, and more importantly, in the way they began to experience it. Because the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something else, something that replaced what had been there before, without ever fully explaining what had changed. When the silence settles in, it does not erase what came before. It leaves behind fragments, impressions, echoes that remain preserved in places where time has little power to distort them. And among the most enduring of these places are the ancient records themselves, carved carefully into clay by hands that likely believed they were documenting something real, something immediate, something undeniable. The earliest tablets from ancient Mesopotamia do not speak in metaphors. They do not describe distant myths or symbolic forces detached from human experience. Instead, they present a world in which interaction between humans and higher beings appears structured, almost routine. Instructions are given, decisions are influenced, knowledge is transferred in ways that suggest a relationship far more direct than what later traditions would imply. These records describe beings who were not hidden. They were named, categorized and remembered with a level of detail that feels less like imagination and more like observation. Cities were said to be established under their guidance. Kingship itself was described as something that descended rather than emerged naturally. Even agriculture, law, and construction were often attributed to this external source, as though early humanity did not see itself as the origin of its own advancement. And yet, as these records continue through time, something subtle begins to shift. The tone does not disappear, but it softens. The clarity becomes less defined. What once felt immediate begins to feel slightly removed, as if the writers are no longer documenting direct experiences, but rather preserving accounts that are already beginning to fade. The language becomes less certain, less grounded in present interaction, and more anchored in memory. It is not that the beings are suddenly gone from the texts. They remain present, but their role begins to change. Instead of guiding, they are referenced. Instead of interacting, they are remembered. The structure of the relationship transforms without ever being openly explained. And this is where the echo becomes most noticeable. Because an echo carries a unique quality. It proves that something was once there, yet it also confirms that it is no longer present in the same way. It is a lingering trace of a voice that has already moved on. The ancient records begin to feel like that. They do not deny the existence of what came before. In fact, they preserve it with care. But they also reflect a growing distance, a quiet separation that is never fully addressed, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. What makes this shift even more intriguing is the absence of reaction within the texts themselves. There is no clear moment of confusion, no recorded crisis of abandonment. Instead, the transition unfolds with an almost unsettling calm, as if those who lived through it either accepted the change or did not fully recognize it as it was happening. And that raises a deeper thought. If the people closest to these events did not clearly document the moment of absence, then perhaps the change was not experienced as a sudden loss, but as something far more gradual, something that blended into the natural flow of time, until one day the presence that once defined their world had become nothing more than a distant memory, preserved in clay and carried forward by those who no longer experienced it themselves. Even after the presence faded, something remained. Not in the form of clear instruction or visible interaction, but in patterns, in habits. In the quiet ways humans continued to behave, as if guided by something they could no longer see. It is here that the silence becomes more complex, because it is not complete. It is layered with memory, though that memory is no longer fully understood. Across different civilizations, separated by distance and time, there are similarities that feel too aligned to be coincidence. Structures built with precision that suggests intention beyond immediate necessity. Rituals repeated with care, even when their original meaning appears to have been lost. Symbols carried forward generation after generation, even as their interpretation slowly shifts. It is as though humanity did not simply forget. It remembered, but without clarity. Ancient cultures continued to construct spaces that seemed designed not just for living, but for connection. Temples aligned with celestial patterns, cities organized with deliberate symmetry, as sacred sites placed in locations that appear chosen rather than discovered. These choices do not feel random, they feel inherited, as if they were once guided by a system that no longer actively reveals itself. And yet, the people who continued these traditions often could not fully explain why they did so. The actions remained. The reasons became distant. This creates a kind of quiet tension within human history, a sense that something meaningful persists beneath the surface, even when its origin is no longer clearly visible. It is not a direct memory, like recalling an event. It is closer to an instinct, something embedded deeply enough that it continues to shape behavior without needing to be consciously understood. Even in mythology, this pattern repeats. Stories emerge that describe beings who once walked among humans, taught them, thus shaped their world, and then left. These stories appear in different forms across different cultures, yet they carry a similar structure. A beginning marked by presence, followed by a gradual withdrawal, and then a lingering absence that is never fully explained. What is most striking is not the stories themselves, but the consistency of the feeling they carry. A sense that something important existed before, something that influenced the direction of human development in ways that are still visible, even if they are no longer understood. And so humanity continues forward, building, organizing, creating, often following patterns that seem older than the civilizations themselves. It is as if the blueprint remains, even when the architect is gone. Or perhaps the architect is not entirely gone. Perhaps what remains is not just memory, but something more subtle, something that continues to shape direction without direct involvement. A quiet influence that does not need to be seen in order to exist. Because a world that remembers, even without understanding, is not entirely disconnected from what came before. It is still carrying it, still reflecting it, still moving within a structure that may have been set long ago and never fully removed. At some point, without a clear moment marking its arrival, a question begins to take shape. It does not appear loudly, nor does it demand attention. It forms quietly, beneath the surface of everything that has already been observed. It emerges from the silence, from the echoes, from the patterns that continue without explanation. And once it is noticed, it does not easily disappear. If something was once present, and that presence shaped the earliest direction of human civilization, then what caused it to fade? This is not a question that ancient records answer directly. They preserve the memory of what was, but they do not clearly describe the moment it ended. They carry traces of interaction, but they do not document a final departure. And this absence of explanation is what gives the question its weight, because there are only a few possibilities that begin to form around it. The first is the simplest, and perhaps the most comfortable to accept, that whatever once existed simply chose to leave. Not as a reaction, not as a consequence, but as a decision. A withdrawal that was intentional, controlled, and perhaps even expected. In this view, the silence is not a mystery, but a phase, a transition from presence to absence that was always meant to happen. But this idea carries its own tension, because if the departure was intentional, then it implies purpose. And if there was purpose, then it raises another question that lingers just beneath the surface. What was the purpose of leaving? The second possibility moves in a different direction, one that is less controlled, less stable. That the absence was not a choice, but a result. Something changed, either within humanity or beyond it, that made the presence no longer possible. A shift that disrupted the connection, whether gradually or suddenly, leaving behind a silence that was not planned but inevitable. This possibility feels different, less structured, less certain, and perhaps more unsettling, because it suggests that whatever existed before may not have intended to disappear at all. And then there is a third possibility, one that does not fully belong to either side. That the presence never truly ended, but changed in a way that is no longer directly visible. That what appears as absence may actually be a form of distance, a shift from interaction to observation, from involvement to something more subtle, more difficult to detect. This idea does not resolve the question, it deepens it, because it suggests that the silence may not be empty, but simply misunderstood. And this is where the question begins to settle into something more permanent, not as a problem to solve, but as a space to think within. Did they leave? Were they forced to? Or are they still here in a way that no longer resembles what once was? And there is no immediate answer. Only the quiet recognition that the absence itself may be the most important clue, and the most difficult one to interpret. Before the silence, before the distance, there was a different kind of world. One that does not feel entirely familiar when viewed from the present, yet appears consistently across the earliest layers of recorded human thought. It was not a world defined by uncertainty about higher forces, but one shaped by proximity to them. In this earlier age, the idea of separation between the human and the divine does not seem to fully exist. The boundary that later civilizations would come to recognize appears either thinner or perhaps not yet established at all. The records do not describe distant observation. They describe involvement, direction, at times even dependence. Cities did not simply rise from human effort alone. They were often said to be founded under instruction, guided by knowledge that seemed to arrive rather than develop. The layout of early settlements, the organization of labor, the introduction of systems that would later define civilization itself. All of these elements appear in a way that suggests design, rather than gradual trial and error. And within this structure, humans did not seem to question the source. There is no visible hesitation in the way these accounts are presented, no sense of disbelief. Instead, there is an acceptance that feels natural, as though the presence of these guiding forces was not something extraordinary, but something expected, something integrated into the rhythm of life itself. Knowledge, in this context, does not feel discovered. It feels given, so agriculture appears with precision. Writing systems emerge with complexity. Legal structures form with a sense of order that seems unusually refined for their time. And throughout these developments, there is a recurring implication that humanity was not acting alone, but responding to something beyond itself. This does not necessarily imply control in the way it might be understood today. It does not feel forced or imposed. It feels structured but stable, as though humans and these higher forces existed within a shared system, each playing a role that did not need to be questioned. Even leadership reflects this pattern. Early kings are often described not as independent rulers, but as intermediaries. Their authority is not entirely their own. It is connected to something greater, something that legitimizes their position and directs their decisions. Power, in this sense, is not self-generated. It is granted or perhaps maintained through alignment with something beyond human origin. And yet, despite this closeness, there is a certain stillness in the way these interactions are described. They are not chaotic, they are not unpredictable. There is a sense of order, of balance, as if the relationship between humanity and these guiding forces followed a structure that was understood, even if not fully explained. This creates an atmosphere that feels almost stable in a way that later periods do not. A world where direction existed, where uncertainty was limited, where the path forward did not need to be constantly questioned because it was already being shaped. And perhaps that is what makes the eventual silence so difficult to interpret. Because if such a presence once existed, so integrated into the foundation of early civilization, then its absence is not simply a disappearance. It is a shift in the very structure of human experience. The transition from being guided to standing alone, or at least appearing to. And as this early age comes into view, it becomes harder to ignore a quiet realization that begins to form beneath the surface. If humanity once lived in a world where something greater was close enough to guide it directly, then everything that followed may not just be a continuation of that world. It may be the result of losing it. When a system is present long enough, it begins to feel natural. Its structure becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is no longer questioned. This is what makes the early formation of civilization so difficult to interpret. It does not appear chaotic or experimental. It appears ordered from the beginning, as if the framework was already in place before humanity fully understood it. The earliest cities were not random collections of shelter. They were organized, deliberate, divided into sections that served specific functions, often aligned with patterns that suggest intention beyond immediate survival. Administrative centers, religious structures, residential zones, all arranged with a precision that implies planning rather than gradual adaptation. And within these environments, roles were clearly defined. Individuals did not simply act based on personal need. They operated within systems that dictated responsibility, hierarchy, and behavior in ways that seem unusually structured for societies still in their early stages. Labor was coordinated. Resources were managed. Authority was centralized. These are not the characteristics of a society still searching for direction. They are the characteristics of a system that already knows where it is going. This is where the idea of control begins to take shape. Not as something oppressive, but as something embedded. A framework that does not need to enforce itself aggressively, because it is already accepted. Already integrated into the way people think, act, and organize their lives. It becomes part of the environment, like the layout of the city itself, shaping behavior without needing constant reinforcement. The laws that emerged during this time reflect the same pattern. They were not vague or evolving, yet they were defined, structured, often presented as originating from a source beyond human authority, which gave them a kind of permanence that did not rely on negotiation or change. Justice was not simply decided. It was delivered according to a system that appeared fixed, as though it had been established before the society itself fully formed. And this raises a subtle but important question. If these systems were created under the influence of something beyond human origin, then were they designed for human benefit, or for stability within a larger structure that humans were only a part of? The answer is not clearly stated in any record, but the consistency of the systems suggests that their purpose was not temporary. They were built to last, is to continue functioning even if the presence that established them was no longer directly involved. This is where the idea of control becomes more complex, because it may not have required constant oversight. A well-designed system does not need to be actively managed at all times. It continues on its own, guided by the rules embedded within it. And if early civilizations were structured in this way, then the absence of direct presence later on would not immediately lead to collapse. The system would continue, the structure would remain, and the people within it would follow patterns that had already been established. This creates a sense of continuity that can be mistaken for independence. But independence is not always the absence of influence. Sometimes it is the continuation of influence, without awareness. And so, as the presence that once shaped these systems begins to fade, the systems themselves do not disappear. They persist, functioning as they were designed to, carrying forward a structure that may have originated from something no longer visible. Which leads to a quiet realization that begins to form beneath the surface. If humanity continued to operate within systems that were not entirely its own creation, then the absence of guidance may not have been immediate. It may have been delayed, hidden within the structure itself, long after the presence that built it had already begun to withdraw. When guidance exists long enough, it begins to shape more than actions. It shapes perception. It defines what feels normal, what feels necessary, and what feels possible. And in a world where direction came from something beyond human origin, it is difficult to imagine that humanity developed without forming a certain level of dependence on that guidance. This dependence would not have felt like weakness. It would have felt like order. In the early stages of civilization, humans were not simply surviving. They were building, organizing, expanding. But much of this development appears to have unfolded within a framework that was already established. Knowledge did not always emerge through slow discovery. In many cases, it seemed to arrive in structured forms, ready to be applied. And when knowledge arrives this way, it changes how it is received. It is not questioned in the same way. It is accepted more easily. It becomes something to follow, rather than something to challenge or reinterpret. Over time, this creates a pattern where humans begin to rely not only on the information itself, but on the source of that information, even if that source is not always fully understood. This is where dependency begins to deepen, not as a conscious reliance, but as an embedded expectation. A sense that direction will continue to come, that structure will remain stable, that the system will hold itself together because it always has. Leadership reflects this as well. If early rulers derived their authority from alignment with something greater, then their role was not to create direction, but to maintain it, to interpret and apply what had already been established. This limits the need for independent decision-making at the highest levels, reinforcing the idea that true authority does not originate within the human system itself. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in mindset. Instead of asking, "What should we do?" the question becomes, "What has already been decided?" And this distinction is important, because it shapes how a society responds to change. If direction is expected to come from outside, then the ability to generate it internally may remain underdeveloped. Not because humans lack the capacity, but because they have not needed to use it in the same way. This creates a kind of quiet stability, but also a hidden vulnerability. As long as the guiding presence remains, the system functions smoothly. Decisions feel aligned, progress appears structured. But if that presence begins to fade, even gradually, the dependency does not immediately disappear with it. It remains. At first, it may not even be noticeable. The systems continue, the patterns hold, but over time, small gaps begin to form. Moments where direction is less clear, where decisions require more interpretation, where the absence of direct guidance begins to create subtle uncertainty. And this is where dependency reveals itself most clearly. Not when everything is working, but when something begins to shift. Because a system that has always relied on external direction may not immediately recognize how to function without it. It may continue forward, following the patterns it knows, but with a growing sense that something is missing. Not something visible, something underlying, something that once provided clarity, now replaced by interpretation. And as this shift continues, humanity begins to move into a different kind of experience, each one where the structure remains. But the source of that structure is no longer present in the same way. And the question that quietly begins to form is not just about what was lost, but about what was never fully developed while it was still there. The transition from presence to absence did not happen all at once. It unfolded in a way that made it difficult to recognize while it was happening. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, the distance began to appear in small, almost unnoticeable ways, as if the connection between humanity and what once guided it was slowly stretching beyond reach. At first, nothing seemed different on the surface. The systems remained intact. The cities continued to function. The rituals were still performed with the same precision, the same intention. Life moved forward as it always had, following patterns that had already been established. But beneath this continuity, something subtle began to shift. The frequency of interaction appeared to change. Where earlier records suggested direct involvement, later accounts began to describe something less immediate. Guidance, if it was still present, no longer felt as direct or as consistent. The tone of communication, once clear and structured, started to feel more distant, more difficult to interpret. It was not a complete absence, it was a reduction, and reduction is harder to notice than disappearance, because it allows the system to continue without interruption. It creates a space where everything appears normal, even as the foundation beneath it begins to change. The people living within this transition may not have fully realized that anything was different, because the structure around them still held its form. But the source of that structure was beginning to step back. This shift can be seen in the way authority itself begins to evolve. Leaders who once may have acted as direct intermediaries now seem to take on a more interpretive role. Instead of receiving clear direction, they begin to rely more on interpretation, tradition, and inherited understanding. The certainty that once defined their position becomes slightly less stable, though not enough to cause immediate disruption. And this creates a new dynamic, one where decisions are no longer based on direct alignment with an external presence, but on the attempt to preserve what was previously established. If the focus shifts from receiving guidance to maintaining continuity, even if the original source of that guidance is no longer actively involved. Over time, this introduces a quiet layer of uncertainty. Not enough to break the system, but enough to change the way it functions. Actions are still taken, structures are still maintained, but the clarity behind them begins to fade. What was once known becomes something that is remembered, interpreted, and sometimes assumed. And yet, the transition remains smooth. There is no sudden collapse, no dramatic disruption. The system adapts, absorbing the change in a way that allows it to continue without drawing attention to what has been lost. This is what makes the distance so difficult to identify. Because it does not interrupt. It blends. It becomes part of the natural flow of time. It's gradually reshaping the experience of those within it without forcing them to confront it directly. But distance, even when subtle, has consequences. As the connection continues to weaken, the reliance on memory increases. The patterns that once originated from direct guidance must now be maintained without it. And over time, this creates a gap between what was intended and what is understood. A gap that does not immediately break the system, but slowly transforms it. And as this transformation continues, the presence that once defined the structure of early civilization begins to feel less like a reality and more like something that existed before, something that is no longer fully within reach, something that has begun to fade, even if it has not yet completely disappeared. When something fades gradually, and it does not leave behind a clear boundary, it leaves behind changes in tone, in perception, in the way experiences are described. And one of the most revealing places to observe this shift is within language itself. Language carries more than meaning. It reflects proximity. It reveals how close or distant something feels to those describing it. And when examining the transition within ancient records, there is a subtle but consistent transformation that begins to appear. In earlier accounts, descriptions feel immediate. The language is direct, almost observational. It speaks as if the events being recorded are not distant stories, but present realities. The beings described are not abstract forces or symbolic ideas. They are referenced with specificity, with roles, and with actions that suggest involvement in the physical and social structure of human life. There is a kind of certainty in these early descriptions, not the certainty of belief, but the certainty of experience. But as time moves forward, that certainty begins to soften. The language does not disappear, but it shifts in character. What was once described with clarity begins to take on a different quality. The tone becomes less direct, more reflective. Words that once conveyed presence now begin to suggest memory. The descriptions remain, but they feel slightly removed, as though the writer is no longer witnessing, but recalling. This change is not abrupt. It unfolds slowly, almost seamlessly, making it difficult to identify the exact point where the shift begins. But once noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore. But the difference between describing something that is happening and describing something that has already happened is subtle, yet significant. And this distinction begins to appear more frequently. The beings that were once presented as active participants start to feel less immediate. Their actions are still referenced, but with less detail, less clarity. The focus begins to move away from direct interaction and toward interpretation, as if the writers are trying to preserve something they no longer fully experience. This introduces a new layer within the records, a layer of distance, not a complete absence, but a separation between the event and its description. A gap that suggests the experience itself may no longer be occurring in the same way, even if its memory is still being carried forward. Over time, this shift continues to deepen, so that language becomes more symbolic. Descriptions become less grounded in direct observation and more shaped by meaning. The beings once described with specificity begin to take on roles that feel broader, less defined. They become part of narratives, part of systems of belief, rather than direct influences within the world. And yet, the transition remains quiet. There is no clear acknowledgement within the records that something has changed. No direct statement that the presence is gone. Instead, the language adapts, evolving in response to a shift that is never explicitly named. This is what makes the transformation so revealing, because language does not change without reason. It reflects experience. And when experience shifts, language follows. So if the way people describe these beings changed over time, then it suggests that their relationship to them changed as well. Not necessarily in a way that was immediately understood, but in a way that left a trace that remains embedded within the words themselves, waiting to be noticed. Waiting to reveal that something once described as present was slowly becoming something remembered. As language begins to shift, something deeper moves with it. The change is not only in how things are described, but in how they are experienced. What was once immediate starts to feel distant, and what was once part of daily reality begins to take on the shape of something remembered rather than lived. This transition is not defined by a clear event. There is no moment where presence becomes memory all at once. Instead, the shift unfolds gradually, almost gently, as if the connection between humanity and what once guided it is being softened rather than severed. The experience does not disappear, it transforms. At first, the difference is difficult to detect. The same names appear in the records. The same stories are told. The same structures remain in place. But the way these elements are positioned begins to change. Instead of describing ongoing interaction, the records begin to preserve accounts of what had already happened. The focus moves from the present to the past, from participation to recollection. And this subtle redirection carries meaning, because memory functions differently than experience. Experience is immediate. It does not require interpretation. It exists in the moment, clear and direct. Memory, on the other hand, introduces distance. It requires reconstruction. It depends on what is remembered, what is emphasized, and what is gradually forgotten. As the records begin to reflect memory rather than presence, they also begin to change in tone. Details become less precise. Descriptions become broader. Events are preserved, but the clarity surrounding them begins to fade. What was once understood directly now requires explanation, and explanation, by its nature, introduces variation. Different interpretations begin to emerge. The same events are told in slightly different ways. The same figures are described with different qualities. The consistency that once defined the records begins to loosen, replaced by layers of retelling that slowly reshape the original experience. This is how presence becomes memory. Not through disappearance, but through distance. And distance changes everything. Because once something moves into memory, it no longer exists in the same way. It becomes part of a narrative rather than part of reality. It can be preserved, repeated, and passed forward, but it is no longer something that can be directly accessed. This creates a new relationship between humanity and what came before. One based not on interaction, but on remembrance. And remembrance carries its own limitations. It preserves, but it also alters. It maintains, but it also transforms. Over time, memory begins to shape itself according to the needs and understanding of those who carry it. It adapts, sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly, until what remains is no longer exactly what once was, but a version of it that has been filtered through generations. And yet, even in this altered form, something essential remains. A sense that what is being remembered was once real, not imagined, not symbolic, but experienced in a way that left a lasting impression strong enough to be carried forward, even as its clarity fades. This is what gives memory its quiet power. It does not need to be perfect to endure. It only needs to persist. And as presence becomes memory, the connection is not entirely lost. It is simply moved further away, placed into a space where it can still be reached, but only through reflection, only through reconstruction, only through the quiet act of remembering something that can no longer be directly seen. When presence fades into memory, a new layer begins to form between what once was and how it is now understood. That layer is interpretation. It does not arrive suddenly, but grows slowly, filling the space left behind by direct experience. And over time, it becomes the primary way through which the past is accessed. In the absence of clear interaction, humans begin to explain, not out of certainty, but out of necessity. What was once understood through direct contact now requires meaning to be constructed around it. The stories remain, the records persist, but their original clarity is no longer fully available. This creates a condition where explanation becomes essential, even if that explanation is incomplete. This is where interpretation begins to take shape. Individuals and groups step into the role of understanding what can no longer be directly observed. They organize the past into narratives that can be communicated, preserved, and passed forward. They assign meaning to events, you define the roles of the beings once described, and attempt to maintain coherence within a system that no longer reveals itself as clearly as it once did. But interpretation carries a unique quality. It does not replicate experience, it reshapes it. Each attempt to explain introduces a slight variation, a shift in emphasis, a change in perspective. Over time, these variations begin to accumulate, creating multiple layers of understanding that may not fully align with one another. What was once a direct relationship becomes a collection of interpretations about that relationship. This does not necessarily create confusion immediately. At first, interpretation provides stability. It allows continuity to exist where direct knowledge has faded. It gives structure to memory, thus helping to preserve it in a form that can still guide behavior and belief. But as generations pass, the distance between the original experience and its interpretation begins to grow. And with that distance, uncertainty increases. Different interpretations begin to emerge. different explanations for the same events, the same figures, the same structures. Some focus on preserving tradition. Others attempt to redefine it. Some remain close to the original tone, while others introduce new elements that reflect the changing perspective of the time. This creates a gradual divergence, not a complete break, but a widening of possibilities. A movement away from a single, shared understanding toward multiple ways of seeing the same past. And within this divergence, something important begins to fade. Not the memory itself, but the clarity of its origin. Because when interpretation becomes the primary lens through which the past is viewed, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between what was directly experienced and what has been added over time. The boundary between observation and explanation begins to blur, and yet interpretation continues to grow. It becomes embedded within systems of belief, within cultural traditions, within the frameworks that guide how societies understand their own origins. It shapes identity, not by preserving the past exactly as it was, but by transforming it into something that can still be held on to. This transformation is not necessarily intentional. It is a natural response to distance. But it raises a quiet realization, so that what humanity now understands about what once was may no longer be a reflection of direct experience, but a reflection of how that experience has been interpreted over time. And within that realization, a subtle question begins to form. Not about whether the past was real, but about how much of it remains unchanged. As interpretation settles into place, something even quieter begins to happen. The absence that once carried weight, that once raised questions, slowly loses its intensity. It does not disappear, but it becomes familiar. And familiarity has a way of softening even the most profound changes. What was once noticed begins to blend into the background. Generations grow up within a world where direct presence is no longer expected. They inherit the stories, the structures, the interpretations, but not the experience itself. For them, the idea that something once interacted directly with humanity is not a memory. It is a concept, something learned rather than something lived. And this distinction changes everything. Because when something is learned instead of experienced, it does not carry the same urgency. It does not demand the same attention. It becomes part of knowledge rather than part of reality. And over time, knowledge can be organized, categorized, even set aside without disrupting daily life. This is how silence becomes normal, not through forgetting, but through adaptation. The absence that once might have felt unusual begins to feel expected. The gap between what was and what is no longer stands out. It becomes part of the natural structure of the world, something that does not need to be questioned because it has always been this way, at least for those living within it. The systems continue to function, the traditions remain. The interpretations provide enough structure to maintain continuity. And within this continuity, the absence is no longer seen as a disruption. It is simply the way things are. This creates a stable environment, but also a quiet shift in perception. Because when silence becomes normal, the motivation to question it begins to fade. The curiosity that might have once driven deeper understanding becomes less immediate. The focus moves toward maintaining what exists, rather than exploring what might be missing. And yet, something still lingers beneath the surface. Even within a normalized silence, there are moments where the absence can be felt. Not as a clear awareness, but as a subtle sense that something is not fully complete. A feeling that does not always take form, but occasionally surfaces in the way people search for meaning, in the way they look beyond what is immediately visible. These moments do not disrupt the system. They exist quietly within it. But they suggest that normalization does not erase what came before. It only changes how it is perceived. Over time, the silence becomes integrated into human experience. It shapes expectations. It defines boundaries. It sets the limits of what is considered possible. And within those limits, humanity continues to move forward, building upon structures that were established long ago, interpreting memories that have been carried across generations, and living within a world where absence is no longer questioned. But the silence, even when accepted, is not entirely empty. It holds within it the trace of something that once existed, something that shaped the beginning, something that even now remains just beyond full understanding. And as the silence becomes normal, the question does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter, waiting beneath the surface, unchanged, even as everything around it continues to move forward. When absence is left unexplained, the mind begins to search for patterns that might give it shape. It looks for tension, for imbalance, for signs that something within the system itself may have shifted. And among the possibilities that begin to emerge, one of the most persistent is the idea of conflict. Not human conflict, which is visible and documented, but something beyond it. A form of disagreement or division that may have existed within the very forces that once guided humanity. It is an idea that appears quietly within fragments of ancient narratives, often not stated directly, but implied through subtle variations in tone and perspective. Some records speak of different figures with differing roles, differing intentions, even differing approaches to how humanity should be shaped or guided. These distinctions are not always framed as opposition, but they carry a sense of divergence, a suggestion that what once appeared unified may not have been entirely aligned beneath the surface. If such a division existed, it introduces a possibility that changes how the silence is understood. Because absence, in this case, would not be a simple withdrawal. It would be the result of disruption, a shift within the structure itself that made continued presence unstable, or perhaps even impossible in its previous form. As this idea is difficult to confirm, but it leaves behind traces. In some accounts, there are references to actions that do not fully align with one another, decisions that seem to contradict, outcomes that suggest competing influences rather than a single, unified direction. These moments are often subtle, embedded within larger narratives, but they hint at something deeper than simple variation. They suggest tension, and tension, when it reaches a certain point, leads to change. If the forces that once guided humanity were not in complete agreement, then the system itself may have begun to destabilize. Not in a visible way, not in a way that would immediately disrupt human life, but in a way that altered the consistency of guidance. The clarity that once defined the relationship may have begun to fragment, replaced by uncertainty or inconsistency. This could explain the gradual nature of the shift, because conflict does not always lead to immediate collapse. It often unfolds slowly, affecting the system from within before becoming visible on the surface. Decisions become less coordinated, actions lose their alignment. The structure begins to weaken, not through destruction, but through division. And in such a state, withdrawal may become necessary. Not as a choice, but as a consequence. If the system that once supported direct interaction could no longer maintain its stability, then stepping back may have been the only way to preserve what remained. The presence that once felt unified would dissolve, not into absence, but into separation. This interpretation does not require complete disappearance. It allows for the possibility that what once existed may still exist, but no longer in the same form, no longer within the same structure that allowed for direct interaction with humanity. And this creates a different kind of silence. Not the silence of something that has ended, but the silence of something that has changed in a way that is no longer accessible. A silence shaped not by emptiness, but by distance created through division. What makes this idea particularly difficult to dismiss is the way it aligns with patterns that are familiar. Systems, whether human or otherwise, rarely collapse without internal strain. Stability depends on alignment, and when that alignment breaks, the system does not simply continue unchanged. It adapts, it fragments, or it withdraws. If such a process occurred on a level beyond human perception, it may not have been recorded in a way that is easy to recognize. It may exist only as a subtle shift in tone, in consistency, in the way ancient narratives begin to diverge rather than align. And so the question remains, but takes on a new form. Not just why the presence faded, but whether that fading was the result of something that happened within it, something that altered its structure, something that made its continued involvement with humanity no longer possible in the way it once was. A conflict not fully seen, but quietly reflected in the silence that followed. Another possibility begins to take shape when the focus shifts away from what may have changed beyond humanity and toward what may have changed within it. Because absence does not always originate from the one who leaves. Sometimes it emerges from the one who is left behind. If early humanity existed within a system shaped by external guidance, then it is possible that, over time, something within that system began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, in a way that altered the balance between guidance and independence. At the beginning, dependence may have been necessary. The systems that defined early civilization required structure, coordination, and knowledge that may not have yet developed internally. Guidance provided direction. It established patterns. It created stability in a world that was still forming its identity. But once those systems were in place, something else began to develop alongside them. Adaptation. Humans do not remain static within a system. They respond to it. They learn from it. They begin to internalize the patterns that once came from outside. And over time, this internalization changes the relationship between the individual and the structure that guides them. What was once followed becomes understood. What was once received becomes replicated. This is where evolution, not in the biological sense alone, but in the cognitive and behavioral sense, begins to influence the system itself. As humans grow more capable of interpreting, organizing, and creating within the framework they were given, the need for constant external direction may begin to decrease. Not because the system is no longer valid, but because its function has been absorbed into those who operate within it. And this creates a subtle shift in balance. Guidance that was once necessary becomes less essential, not obsolete, but less central. And our humans begin to operate with a level of independence that was not present before, even if they are still following the patterns established earlier. This shift may not have been immediately noticeable. It may have appeared as progress, as growth, as the natural development of a system reaching maturity. But from another perspective, it could also be seen as a change in compatibility. Because if the original system was designed for a certain level of dependence, then increased independence could alter how that system functions. The relationship between guidance and those being guided would no longer remain the same. And in such a situation, distance may begin to form, not as rejection, but as adjustment. If humanity began to operate with greater autonomy, then the role of external influence may have needed to change as well. Yet direct interaction may no longer have been necessary, or perhaps no longer effective in the same way. The system may have transitioned from active guidance to something more passive, more observational. This would not require a dramatic departure. It would only require a shift in how the relationship was maintained. And from the human perspective, this shift could easily appear as absence. Because when direct interaction fades, even if influence remains in a different form, it becomes harder to detect. The connection feels weaker, even if it has not fully disappeared. This interpretation introduces a different kind of possibility. That the silence which followed was not entirely the result of something leaving, but partly the result of something changing within humanity itself. A development that altered the need for direct presence, even if that presence had once been essential. But this idea carries its own uncertainty. Because evolution does not always lead to clarity. It can create new abilities, but also new limitations. Independence can bring freedom, but also separation. And if the shift toward autonomy created distance, then it also raises a deeper question. Was humanity ready for that distance? Or did the change occur without fully understanding what would be lost along with it? Because if the presence that once guided humanity stepped back in response to human development, then the silence is not simply an absence. It is part of a transition, a movement from one state of existence to another. And within that movement, something may have been gained, while something else, perhaps equally important, quietly faded into the background, leaving behind a world that continues to move forward, but no longer in the same way it once did. Not all change begins from within a system. Sometimes it comes from forces that exist far beyond it, shaping outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible from the inside. And when considering the quiet disappearance of what once guided humanity, another possibility begins to emerge, one that does not depend on intention, conflict, or evolution, but on conditions. Conditions that may have changed. The early world was not static. It was part of a larger environment, one that extended beyond human awareness. The sky itself, the movement of celestial bodies, the cycles of the earth. All of these elements formed a dynamic system that influenced life in ways that early civilizations could observe, but not fully control. So if the presence that once interacted with humanity depended, even partially, on specific conditions, then any shift in those conditions could have altered that interaction. Not abruptly, but gradually. Just as seasons change without a clear dividing line, larger environmental or cosmic transitions can unfold over time, reshaping the possibilities within a system without immediately revealing their full impact. There are hints scattered across ancient records that suggest periods of disruption, changes in climate, shifts in stability, events that altered the rhythm of life, sometimes subtly, sometimes more visibly. These changes are not always described in detail, but they are present enough to suggest that the world itself was not always consistent. And within this changing environment, the nature of interaction may have been affected. If the conditions that once allowed for direct presence began to shift, then that presence may have become more difficult to maintain. Not because it was intended to end, but because the environment no longer supported it in the same way. This introduces a different kind of explanation, one where absence is not a decision, but a consequence of alignment being disrupted. A system that once functioned smoothly begins to encounter limitations, not from within, but from changes in the external environment. The connection weakens, not because it is intentionally withdrawn, but because it becomes less sustainable under new conditions. And this weakening would not necessarily be obvious at first. It would appear as a reduction in clarity, a decrease in frequency, a subtle shift in the nature of interaction. As the same patterns seen earlier begin to reappear, but now with a different underlying cause. Distance, not chosen, not forced, but created by circumstance. This perspective expands the scale of the question. It moves beyond human development and beyond internal dynamics, placing the focus on the larger system within which everything exists. A system that includes not just the Earth, but the broader environment that surrounds it, an environment that is constantly in motion, constantly evolving. And within such a system, stability is never permanent. Conditions change, alignments shift. What is possible in one period may not be possible in another. If the presence that once guided humanity depended on a specific alignment of conditions, then its fading could simply be the result of those conditions no longer existing in the same form. This does not imply complete disappearance. It suggests limitation, a reduction in the ability to interact in the way that was once possible. And from the human perspective, that limitation would appear as absence. Because what can no longer be directly experienced becomes indistinguishable from what is no longer there. This idea does not provide a clear answer. It does not identify a specific event or moment, but it offers a different way of understanding the silence. Not as something that was chosen, or something that was lost through conflict or change within humanity, but as something shaped by forces beyond both. Forces that continue to move, even now. Forces that may still influence what is possible, even if their impact is no longer clearly understood. And within that possibility, the silence becomes something more than an ending. It becomes a condition, one that may not be permanent, but simply part of a larger cycle of change that has yet to fully reveal itself. There is another possibility that does not emerge from conflict or evolution or shifting conditions, but from intention. A quieter, more deliberate idea that suggests the absence was never a disruption at all, but a step within a larger design. Not a loss, but a transition that was meant to unfold exactly as it did. If the presence that once guided humanity had purpose, then it is possible that its role was never meant to be permanent. At the beginning, guidance may have been necessary. Structure had to be established. Systems had to be formed. Direction had to be introduced into a world that had not yet developed its own internal stability. In this phase, direct involvement would not only make sense, so it would be essential. Without it, the foundation itself might never have taken shape. But once that foundation was complete, the role of guidance may have needed to change. Because continuous presence can limit growth. If direction is always provided, then the ability to generate it independently may never fully develop. A system that is constantly guided does not learn to guide itself. It functions, but it does not evolve beyond its initial design. And if the intention was not just to build a system, but to create something capable of sustaining itself, then withdrawal may have been required, not as abandonment but as release. A shift from direct involvement to absence, allowing humanity to continue forward without relying on the same level of external influence. This would not be a sudden departure. It would be gradual, measured, and allowing the system to adjust without collapsing under the weight of change. This perspective aligns with the way the transition appears in the records. There is no clear break, no dramatic ending, only a slow fading, a quiet stepping back that allows continuity to remain intact while the nature of interaction changes. The systems continue, the structures hold. But the presence becomes less direct, less visible, until it eventually feels absent altogether. From within the system, this would appear as loss. But from another perspective, it could be seen as completion, the end of one phase and the beginning of another. This idea introduces a different kind of meaning to the silence. Not as something empty, but as something intentional. A space created for development, for independence, for the emergence of something that could not exist under constant guidance. The absence becomes part of the design, not a flaw within it. And yet, even within this interpretation, uncertainty remains. Because if the withdrawal was planned, then it raises questions that extend beyond the act itself. Was it temporary or permanent? Was it meant to be noticed or accepted without question? Was the system expected to evolve beyond its original structure, or simply maintain it without direct involvement? These questions do not have clear answers, but they reshape how the silence is understood. It is no longer just the absence of something that was lost. It becomes the presence of something that was left behind. A system, a structure, a direction that continues to operate even without visible guidance. It's a framework that may still carry the influence of what created it, even if that influence is no longer directly expressed. And within that framework, humanity continues to move forward, building, adapting, evolving, often without fully realizing that the conditions it exists within may have been shaped long before it began to understand them. If this interpretation holds even a fragment of truth, then the silence is not the end of a story. It is a turning point, a moment where direct presence gives way to something less visible, but not necessarily less significant. A moment where the question is no longer just about what left, but about what was meant to remain. When something central fades, the effects are not always immediate, especially when that presence was deeply embedded within systems that were designed to continue. As in the case of early humanity, the absence did not result in collapse. It resulted in continuity, at least on the surface. Life did not stop. Cities remained active. Structures held their form. Rituals were still performed with the same precision, the same repetition. From a distance, everything appeared unchanged. And for those living within that moment, there may not have been a clear awareness that anything had shifted at all. But beneath that continuity, something subtle began to move. The certainty that once defined direction was no longer as clear. Decisions still had to be made, but they no longer carried the same sense of alignment. Actions were still taken, but the clarity behind them began to feel less direct. The system continued, but the source of its guidance had begun to recede. At first, this did not create disruption, because the structure was strong enough to sustain itself. The patterns that had been established were repeated, followed, maintained. Leaders continued to lead. Workers continued to work. The rhythm of life remained intact. And in this stability, the absence remained hidden, not because it was invisible, but because it did not immediately interfere with function. This is what makes the aftermath so difficult to recognize. It does not appear as loss, it appears as continuation. But continuation without direct guidance begins to introduce something new. Interpretation becomes more necessary. Decisions require more internal reasoning. The reliance on inherited patterns increases because there is no longer a clear external source to provide immediate direction. And within this shift, a quiet form of uncertainty begins to develop. Not enough to disrupt the system, but enough to change how it feels. The difference is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it is present. Moments where clarity once existed now require thought. Situations that may have once been guided now rely on judgment. The system is still functioning, but it is beginning to operate in a different way. This creates a kind of silent transition, from guided action to interpreted action, from certainty to approximation. And yet, the people within this transition may not have fully recognized it as it was happening, because nothing had broken, nothing had collapsed. The world they lived in still made sense, at least within the boundaries of what they understood. The structures were still there. The traditions still held meaning. The memory of what once existed was still present, though even if it was becoming more distant. And so life continued. But continuation does not mean nothing has changed. It only means that the change has not yet reached a point where it forces recognition. Over time, these small shifts begin to accumulate. The reliance on interpretation grows. The distance from direct experience increases. The system adapts, slowly reshaping itself around the absence, even if that absence is not fully acknowledged. And within this adaptation, something important begins to take form. A new way of existing. One that does not depend on direct presence, but still carries the imprint of it. A way of moving forward that feels stable, yet slightly different. As if something fundamental has shifted, but without leaving behind a clear moment to mark when it happened. As time moves forward, the initial stability begins to settle into something more permanent. What once felt like a transition becomes a condition. The systems that were built under guidance continue to operate, but now they do so without the same connection to their original source. And yet, they do not collapse. They persist. This persistence is what makes the situation so complex. Because from the outside, it can appear as though nothing essential was lost. The structures remain. The hierarchies continue. The laws are still followed. The rituals are still performed. Everything that defines a functioning civilization is still present. But something within that system has changed. The origin of direction is no longer active. And without that origin, the system begins to rely on itself. At first, this reliance does not create visible problems, or the framework is strong enough to maintain order. The patterns are deeply embedded. People continue to follow what has already been established, repeating actions that have been carried forward across generations. But repetition is not the same as understanding, and over time, this difference begins to matter. When a system operates without direct guidance, it begins to depend on interpretation more heavily. Decisions are made based on what is believed to be correct, rather than what is clearly aligned with an external source. This introduces variation, even if it is subtle at first. Different regions may begin to interpret the same structures in slightly different ways. Different leaders may apply the same principles with slight variations. Different traditions may evolve from the same origin, each maintaining a connection to the past, but not always in the same form. This does not immediately break the system, but it begins to stretch it. The consistency that once defined it starts to loosen. Not enough to cause collapse, but enough to create divergence. Over time, these small differences begin to accumulate, creating a network of systems that share a common origin, but no longer function in complete alignment. And within this divergence, something else begins to emerge. Adaptation. Without direct guidance, the system must respond to new conditions on its own. It must adjust, evolve, and reorganize itself in ways that were not explicitly designed from the beginning. This creates flexibility, but also uncertainty, because adaptation introduces choices, and choices require judgment. This is a different kind of system than what existed before. It's not one that follows a fixed structure, but one that navigates within it. The shift is gradual, almost invisible in its early stages, but over time it becomes more pronounced. The system begins to reflect the people within it more than the source that created it. It becomes shaped by human interpretation, human decision-making, human limitation. And yet, the original structure never fully disappears. It remains as a foundation, a framework that continues to guide behavior, even if its origin is no longer clearly understood. This creates a layered system, one where the past and present exist together, influencing each other in ways that are not always easy to separate. From the outside, it still appears stable, but from within, it is changing. Quietly, gradually, becoming something that no longer relies on direct presence, but still carries the imprint of it. And as this process continues, a new question begins to take shape. Not about whether the system can survive without guidance, but about what it becomes as it continues to evolve without it. As systems continue without direct guidance, a shift begins to take hold within the people themselves. It does not appear as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual adjustment in how decisions are made, how problems are approached, and how direction is understood. Over time, reliance begins to move inward. At first, this change is subtle. The same structures are followed, the same traditions are respected. But the source of confidence begins to shift. Instead of looking outward for clarity, individuals begin to depend more on interpretation, experience, and internal reasoning. What was once received is now constructed. This is the beginning of self-reliance, not as a declared movement, but as a quiet adaptation. As generations pass without direct interaction, the expectation of guidance begins to fade. People no longer wait for direction in the same way. They begin to act within the system rather than respond to it. Decisions become more immediate, more rooted in circumstance rather than alignment with something beyond. This creates a new kind of capability. The ability to function independently within a structure that was not originally self-generated. Humans begin to organize, innovate, and adjust without needing confirmation from an external source. The system becomes more responsive to immediate needs, more flexible in its application. But this independence comes with complexity. Because self-reliance does not replace the original structure, it operates within it. The patterns established earlier still influence behavior. The systems still provide a framework, but within that framework, humans begin to introduce variation. They adapt rules, reinterpret meanings, and reshape practices to fit changing conditions. Over time, this creates a layered dynamic, a foundation that remains consistent, combined with a surface that is constantly evolving. The system becomes both stable and flexible, capable of maintaining continuity, while also adjusting to new realities. And within this process, something important begins to shift. Responsibility. When guidance is external, responsibility is shared. Decisions are aligned with something beyond the individual. But as reliance moves inward, responsibility becomes more personal. The outcomes are no longer tied to direct instruction, but to interpretation and action. This introduces a new dimension to human experience. The need to choose without certainty, to act without confirmation, to move forward without knowing if the direction is fully aligned with what once guided it. At first, this may feel like growth, an expansion of capability. But it also introduces a quiet tension, because independence removes the assurance that comes with guidance. It creates space for innovation, but also for error. It allows for progress, but also for divergence from the original structure. And over time, this divergence becomes more noticeable. Different paths emerge, different interpretations take hold. The system continues, but it becomes more varied, more complex, as shaped increasingly by human influence rather than the original source. And yet, even within this independence, traces of the past remain. The patterns are still there, the structures still hold, the memory of guidance still exists, even if it is no longer experienced directly. This creates a unique state, one where humanity is capable of standing on its own, but still shaped by something that came before. A balance between independence and inheritance. And as this balance continues to evolve, another question begins to form. Not about whether humanity can function without guidance, but about how far it can move away from it, before something essential begins to fade beyond recognition. As independence grows and systems continue to evolve, there is a shift that becomes more difficult to describe. It is not visible in structures or clearly reflected in records. It does not disrupt the surface of civilization in a way that can be easily measured. And yet, it is present. A quiet sense that something has been lost. Not something material. Not something that can be named or pointed to directly. But something underlying. Something that once existed within the connection between humanity and what guided it, now no longer fully accessible. At first, this loss is not recognized, because everything appears to be functioning. Cities expand, knowledge grows, systems adapt. Humanity continues to move forward, developing new ways of understanding the world and its place within it. From a practical perspective, progress is evident. The absence of direct guidance does not prevent advancement. But progress and completeness are not always the same. As time passes, subtle differences begin to emerge in the way humans experience their own existence. Not in what they do, but in how they relate to what they do. There is a shift in depth, in connection, in the sense of alignment that once may have been more immediate. This is difficult to define, because it does not present itself clearly. It appears in moments of uncertainty that do not have clear causes, in the search for meaning that does not always reach resolution, in the persistence of questions that seem to exist without clear answers, even as knowledge continues to expand. It is as if something that once provided a sense of coherence, a sense that everything was part of a larger structure that could be directly experienced, has become less accessible. Not gone, but distant. And this distance changes how meaning is constructed. Yes, without direct connection, meaning becomes something that must be built rather than received. It becomes more subjective, more dependent on interpretation, more influenced by individual and cultural perspective. This allows for diversity in understanding, but it also creates fragmentation, different ways of seeing the same reality, different attempts to define what cannot be directly confirmed. And within this fragmentation, the sense of something unified begins to fade. Not completely, but enough to be felt. This creates a subtle tension within human experience, a movement between what is known and what feels just beyond understanding, a balance between clarity and uncertainty that does not fully resolve. Even as systems become more advanced, even as knowledge becomes more detailed, there remains a space that does not seem to be filled. A space that may have once been occupied by something else, something that connected the structure of the world with the experience of living within it in a way that is no longer fully present. This is the kind of loss that does not interrupt function, but it changes perception. It alters the way humans relate to existence itself, even if they are not always aware of it. It introduces a quiet layer of distance between what is experienced and what is understood. And over time, this distance becomes part of the human condition, accepted, normalized, but never entirely resolved. Because even without a clear memory, even without a direct reference, there remains a sense that something once existed, that gave a different kind of clarity to the world. And that clarity, whatever it was, is no longer fully within reach. Even as absence settles into the structure of human experience, not everything from before disappears. Some things remain, not as clear answers, but as traces. And among the most enduring of these traces are the structures that still stand, silent and unmoving, yet carrying within them a kind of presence that does not fully belong to the time in which they were built. Across different regions of the world, there are sites that seem to reflect a level of precision that feels difficult to fully explain within the context of their time. Massive stone constructions, aligned with careful accuracy, positioned in ways that suggest intention beyond immediate necessity. These are not simply shelters or defensive structures. They appear designed with a deeper purpose, one that does not always reveal itself clearly. What makes these structures particularly striking is not just their scale, but their consistency. They follow patterns, proportions repeat, alignments appear intentional, orientations correspond to celestial movements with a level of accuracy that implies careful observation but also something more structured than simple trial and error. The placement of these sites often reflects a relationship with the sky, as if they were built not only in response to the earth, but in connection with something beyond it. This raises a quiet question. Were these constructions purely the result of human effort, developed independently across different cultures? Or do they reflect a shared influence that shaped how early civilizations understood space, structure, and alignment? There is no clear answer, but the similarities remain, and similarities across distance suggest connection, even when that connection is not fully understood. Some of these structures also carry an unusual quality of endurance. Built to last not just for generations, but for spans of time that extend far beyond the typical needs of a civilization. Their design does not feel temporary. It feels deliberate, as if they were meant to persist, to remain as fixed points within a changing world. This persistence gives them a different kind of significance. They are not just remnants of the past. They are anchors, points where something from an earlier time continues to exist within the present, unchanged in its form, even as everything around it evolves. And within that stillness, there is a sense that these structures carry more than their physical presence. They carry intention, not necessarily in a way that can be easily defined, but in a way that can be felt through their design, their placement, and their consistency. They suggest that those who built them were working within a framework that extended beyond immediate necessity, beyond survival, beyond simple function. And if that framework was influenced by something beyond human origin, then these structures may represent more than architectural achievement. They may represent the physical imprint of a system that once guided how space itself was understood. A system that is no longer directly accessible, but still visible in the patterns left behind. Even without clear answers, these structures continue to stand, quietly, unchanged, holding within them a trace of something that once shaped the way humanity built, organized, and aligned itself with the world. And as long as they remain, they continue to suggest that the past is not entirely gone. It is still present, in forms that do not speak, but still reveal. Beyond stone and structure, there are other traces that persist, less visible, yet just as enduring. These are not built from physical materials, but from meaning. Symbols that appear across distant cultures, repeating with subtle variations, carrying forms that feel familiar even when separated by time and geography. Unlike architecture, symbols do not require permanence to survive. They move, they adapt, they pass from one generation to another, shifting slightly with each transition, yet retaining something essential at their core. And it is within this movement that a different kind of pattern begins to emerge. Across early civilizations, certain shapes and motifs appear again and again, circular forms representing cycles or continuity, winged figures suggesting movement between realms, tree-like structures symbolizing connection between levels of existence, geometric patterns that reflect balance, symmetry, and order. These symbols do not belong to one place alone. They appear in multiple regions, often without direct contact, yet carrying a sense of shared meaning. This repetition raises a quiet possibility, that these symbols are not entirely independent creations, but reflections of a common influence, not necessarily copied, but remembered in a way that transcends direct communication. as if the underlying ideas they represent were once part of a shared framework, and one that extended beyond individual cultures and remained embedded even as those cultures developed separately. Symbols function differently than language. They do not require precise translation. They convey meaning through form, through association, through a kind of recognition that does not always rely on explanation. This allows them to persist even when their original context is lost. They evolve, but they do not disappear. And within that persistence, something remains. A trace of the original intention behind them, even if that intention is no longer fully understood. Over time, interpretations of these symbols begin to shift. Different cultures assign different meanings, shaped by their own experiences and beliefs. What once may have represented a direct concept becomes more abstract, more layered, more open to interpretation. And the symbol remains, but its clarity begins to fade, replaced by multiple possibilities. This mirrors the larger pattern already observed, from presence to memory, from memory to interpretation. And now, within symbols, the same process continues. Yet even as meanings change, the forms themselves remain surprisingly consistent. This consistency suggests that something deeper is being preserved. Not the exact message, but the structure of the message. A framework of meaning that continues to exist, even as its details shift. And this leads to a subtle realization that symbols may carry fragments of a system that once provided direct understanding. Fragments that have survived not through preservation of knowledge, but through repetition of form. A kind of memory that exists without words, without clear explanation, but still capable of being recognized, even now. Because when a symbol appears across different cultures, across different times, carrying a sense of familiarity that is difficult to fully explain, it suggests that something within it has endured beyond its original context, something that continues to move through human experience. Quietly, subtly, connecting the present to a past that is no longer fully visible, but not entirely gone. While symbols move through form, language carries meaning in a different way. It is more precise, more structured, yet also more fragile. Words can change, sounds can shift, meanings can evolve or disappear entirely. And yet, even within this constant movement, there are moments where something older seems to surface. Echoes that suggest connections not immediately visible. Across early languages, there are patterns that appear unexpectedly similar. Not always identical, not always obvious, but present enough to raise questions about how these similarities came to exist. Words that carry related meanings across distant regions. Sounds that align in ways that feel more than coincidental. Structures that reflect shared ways of organizing thought. At first, these similarities can be explained through migration, through contact, through the natural spread of ideas over time. And in many cases, that explanation is enough. But there are instances where the connections feel deeper, less tied to direct interaction, and more reflective of something that may have existed before these languages fully separated. Language, like symbols, has the ability to preserve traces of earlier frameworks. Not perfectly, but persistently. Even as words change, fragments remain. Roots of meaning that carry forward, embedded within new forms, often unnoticed by those who use them. These fragments do not always reveal themselves clearly. They require attention, comparison, and a willingness to look beneath the surface of what language appears to be. When this is done, a subtle pattern begins to emerge. Concepts that relate to order, to creation, to hierarchy, often share underlying similarities across cultures. Terms associated with authority, with origin, with structure, sometimes reflect common foundations, even when the languages themselves have diverged significantly. This does not necessarily prove a single origin, but it suggests continuity, a thread that connects different linguistic systems in ways that are not always explained by direct contact alone. And within this continuity, there is a possibility. That language, like architecture and symbolism, carries remnants of something that once provided a shared framework for understanding. Not a universal language in the modern sense, but a set of core ideas that influenced how language itself developed. Ideas that were once clear, once directly understood, and later transformed as they were carried forward through memory and interpretation. Over time, these echoes become more difficult to recognize. Languages evolve. They adapt to new environments, new cultures, new needs. The original connections become layered, obscured by centuries of change. But even within this transformation, traces remain, subtle alignments, unexpected similarities, patterns that do not fully disappear, even as everything around them continues to shift. Yet these echoes do not speak clearly. They do not provide direct answers. But they suggest that something once connected the way humans understood the world, not just in symbols or structures, but in the very words they use to describe it. And if that connection once existed, then its influence may still be present, hidden within language itself, not as a clear message, but as a quiet resonance. A reminder that what is spoken today may still carry fragments of something much older, something that once shaped not only how humans lived, but how they understood existence itself. Beyond structures, symbols, and language, there is another layer that carries traces of what came before. It is less tangible, less defined, yet deeply embedded within the way humans live and repeat certain patterns across time. This layer is cultural memory. It does not exist in a single place. It is not written in one record or preserved in one form. It moves through behavior, through traditions, through rituals that continue long after their original meaning has begun to fade. It is carried not always by conscious understanding, but by repetition, by the act of doing something because it has always been done. Across different cultures, there are practices that appear ancient yet remain active. Rituals performed with care, even when their purpose is no longer fully understood. Ceremonies that follow specific sequences, as if they were once guided by a structure that is now only partially remembered. Patterns of behavior that seem to connect people to something beyond the immediate moment, even if they cannot clearly define what that connection is. These practices are not random, as they persist because they hold something. Not necessarily clear knowledge, but a sense of continuity. A feeling that what is being repeated carries value, even if that value is no longer fully explained. And within that repetition, something from the past continues to move forward. Cultural memory functions differently than recorded history. History attempts to preserve events as they occurred. Cultural memory preserves the feeling of those events, the patterns that emerged from them, the behaviors that became associated with them. It is less concerned with accuracy and more focused on continuity. This makes it both resilient and difficult to interpret. Because what is preserved may not appear exactly as it once was. It may be altered, simplified, or reshaped over time. But even within these changes, something essential can remain, say a structure beneath the surface, a pattern that continues to guide behavior even when its origin is no longer clearly visible. This can be seen in the way certain rituals align with natural cycles, with movements of the sky, with transitions that feel larger than individual experience. It can be seen in the repetition of gestures, of symbols, of sequences that seem too deliberate to be entirely accidental. These patterns suggest that cultural memory is not simply the result of habit. It is the continuation of something that once held meaning strong enough to endure, even as its explanation faded. And within this endurance, there is a quiet implication that what once guided humanity may not have disappeared completely. It may have transformed into something less direct, less visible, but still present within the structures of behavior that continue across generations, not as clear instruction, but as influence, subtle, embedded, persistent. And because cultural memory operates beneath conscious awareness, it does not require belief to exist. It continues regardless of whether it is fully understood. It shapes actions, reinforces patterns, and maintains connections that might otherwise be lost. In this way, the past is not entirely gone. It is carried forward in forms that do not always reveal themselves openly, but still shape the present in quiet ways. And within these forms, there remains a possibility that something from before is still being remembered. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to leave a trace, enough to suggest that what once was has not entirely disappeared. After everything that remains, after every trace, every pattern, every echo that continues to surface across time, the question does not disappear. It changes form, but it stays present, quietly shaping the way the silence is understood. Did they truly leave? At first, the answer may seem simple. The absence is clear. There is no direct interaction, no visible presence, no continuation of the relationship as it once appeared in the earliest records. From a surface perspective, it feels complete. What once existed is no longer here in the same way. But the deeper the patterns are examined, the more uncertain that conclusion begins to feel. Because absence is not always the same as disappearance. Something can withdraw without vanishing. Something can shift form without ending. And when the traces that remain continue to align in ways that suggest continuity, it becomes difficult to say with certainty that what once existed is entirely gone. The structures still reflect a level of design. The symbols still carry consistent meaning across distance. The language still holds echoes that connect separate cultures. The rituals still repeat patterns that feel inherited rather than invented. Each of these elements, on its own, may not be enough to question the idea of complete departure. But together, they begin to form a different kind of picture. Not one of presence as it once was, but of influence that has not entirely disappeared. This introduces a possibility that is not easily confirmed, but also not easily dismissed. That what once interacted directly with humanity may still exist, but in a way that no longer operates within the same structure. A presence that no longer reveals itself openly, but has not fully withdrawn from the system it once shaped. This would explain the silence in a different way. Not as emptiness, but as distance. A shift from interaction to observation, from direct involvement to something more subtle, more difficult to detect. And within that possibility, the meaning of absence changes. It is no longer a complete separation. It becomes a transformation of relationship, one where the connection still exists, but no longer takes the same form. This idea creates a different kind of tension, because it suggests that the silence may not be a final state. It may be a condition, one that depends on perception, on the ability to recognize something that does not present itself in obvious ways. If the presence that once guided humanity still exists beyond direct awareness, its influence may still be shaping patterns, still affecting direction, still interacting in ways that are not immediately visible. Not through clear instruction, but through subtle alignment, through the continuation of systems that were once established, through the persistence of structures that still guide behavior. And if this is the case, then the question is no longer only about what happened in the past. It becomes something that extends into the present. Because the absence that is experienced may not be the absence of existence. It may be the absence of recognition. And that distinction changes everything. Because if something remains, even in a form that is no longer directly visible, then the silence is not the end of the relationship. It is only a change in how that relationship is experienced. It's a shift that leaves behind just enough trace to suggest that what once was may not be entirely gone. As the possibility of continued presence lingers, another question begins to form alongside it. One that shifts the focus away from what may have remained and toward what may have been intended. Are we meant to be alone? This question does not arise from certainty, but from the patterns already observed. If the absence was gradual, if the systems were designed to continue, if humanity developed the ability to function independently, then it suggests that solitude may not be accidental. It may be part of the structure itself. At the beginning, guidance appears necessary. The foundation of civilization required direction, stability, and knowledge that may not have yet emerged naturally. But once those foundations were established, something changed. The direct presence faded, and humanity was left to continue within a system that could now operate on its own. This shift can be seen as loss, but it can also be seen as transition, a movement from dependence to independence, from being guided to becoming capable of guiding. And within that movement, the experience of being alone may not be a failure of connection, but a stage within it. Because true independence requires separation. Not necessarily permanent separation, but enough distance to allow growth without constant intervention. If guidance had remained constant, the ability to develop internally may never have fully emerged. Humanity would continue to function, but always within the boundaries of external direction. By stepping back, that boundary is removed. But with that removal comes uncertainty. Because independence does not provide clarity in the same way guidance does. It introduces choice, interpretation, variation. It allows for expansion, but also for divergence. It creates a space where direction must be found rather than received. This is where the feeling of being alone begins to take shape. Not as isolation in the physical sense, but as the absence of clear external alignment. A condition where answers are not given directly, where meaning must be constructed rather than revealed. And this condition can feel incomplete, because something that once existed no longer does in the same way. But if this absence was intentional, then it serves a purpose. It creates the conditions for something new to emerge. The ability to think independently, to organize without instruction, to explore without predefined limits, to develop systems that are not simply inherited but created. This does not eliminate the connection to what came before. It changes it. The relationship becomes less direct, less dependent, but potentially more expansive. Instead of being shaped entirely from the outside, humanity begins to shape itself from within. And within this process, the question of being alone becomes more complex. Because solitude does not always mean absence. It can also mean autonomy. A state where connection is no longer obvious, but still exists in ways that are not immediately visible. This introduces a different perspective on the silence. Not as abandonment, but as space. A space that allows for growth, for development, for the emergence of something that could not exist under constant guidance. And yet, even within this space, the question remains. Not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer may not be fixed. Are we alone? Or are we simply experiencing a phase where connection is less visible, but not entirely gone? The silence does not respond. It does not confirm or deny. It only remains, leaving the question open, allowing it to exist without resolution, just as it always has. If the silence is not permanent, then it may not be an ending at all. It may be part of a pattern, a movement that does not occur only once, but repeats in ways that are not immediately obvious. And within that possibility, the idea of cycles begins to take shape. Cycles exist throughout nature, day and night, growth and decay, expansion and contraction. Patterns that repeat, not in identical form, but in recognizable phases. Each phase carries its own conditions, its own characteristics, its own limitations. And yet, none of them exist in isolation. They are part of a larger movement that continues, whether or not it is fully understood. If such patterns apply to the broader structure of existence, then the presence that once guided humanity may not have disappeared entirely. It may have entered a different phase, a phase where direct interaction is reduced or absent, not as a final state, but as part of a recurring process. This would explain the gradual nature of the transition. Cycles do not begin or end abruptly. They shift slowly, moving from one state to another in ways that can be difficult to recognize while they are happening. What feels like a permanent change may actually be a temporary condition within a larger sequence. And within that sequence, presence and absence may alternate, as not necessarily in predictable intervals, but in response to factors that are not fully visible from within the system. Conditions may change, alignments may shift. The same patterns that once allowed for direct interaction may reappear under different circumstances. This introduces a different way of understanding the silence, not as a fixed state, but as part of a movement that continues beyond the present moment. A movement that may eventually return to a form of presence, even if that form is not identical to what once existed. But cycles do not guarantee repetition in the exact same way. Each phase carries change. If presence returns, it may not resemble the past. It may take a different form, operate under different conditions, interact in ways that are not immediately recognizable as the same. And this makes the idea of cycles both intriguing and uncertain, because it suggests continuity, but not predictability. It offers the possibility of return, but without clear timing or structure. And from within the current phase, it is impossible to determine where exactly within the cycle humanity exists. At the beginning, in the middle, or near a transition that has not yet fully revealed itself. This uncertainty does not weaken the idea, it deepens it. Because cycles are not always meant to be fully understood from within. They are experienced, observed over time, recognized only when patterns begin to repeat in ways that connect past and present. And within the traces already examined, there are hints of repetition, patterns that align, structures that reappear, ideas that persist across different periods, even when separated by long spans of time. These hints do not confirm the existence of a cycle, but they suggest the possibility that what once was may not be entirely gone, that what feels like absence may be part of a phase that will eventually shift, and that the silence itself may be temporary, even if it has lasted long enough to feel permanent. Within this possibility, the question changes once again. Not just where the presence went, but whether it is meant to return in a way that cannot yet be fully seen. At the end of every question that does not resolve, there is a quiet space, a place where answers no longer feel necessary, yet the question itself remains. Not as something to solve, but as something to sit with. And it is within this space that everything begins to settle. That the silence that followed the early age of presence has never fully explained itself. It has not revealed a clear cause. It has not confirmed whether it was a departure, a transformation, or a continuation in a form that is no longer visible. It has simply remained, shaping human experience in ways that are often unnoticed, yet deeply embedded. And perhaps that is its role, not to be understood completely, but to create the conditions for reflection. Because when something cannot be fully explained, it invites a different kind of thinking, one that does not rely on certainty, but on awareness, one that does not demand answers, but allows questions to exist without immediate resolution. Throughout everything that has been observed, one pattern remains consistent. Something was present, something changed, and something continues. That these three elements do not form a complete explanation, but they form a structure, a way of understanding the past, not as a fixed story, but as a process that continues to unfold. The presence shaped the beginning, the change introduced distance, and the continuation carries forward everything that remains. Within this structure, humanity exists in a state that is neither fully connected nor entirely separate. It moves forward within systems that were once guided, interpreting traces that still persist, and living within a silence that is not empty, but undefined. This state does not provide clarity, but it provides perspective, because it suggests that what is experienced now is part of something larger than a single moment in time. A movement that began before recorded history and continues beyond what can currently be understood. And within that movement, the absence itself becomes meaningful. Not because it explains anything directly, but because it shapes how everything else is experienced. It creates space for interpretation, for development, for the emergence of ideas that would not exist if everything remained clearly defined. It allows for uncertainty, And uncertainty, while often uncomfortable, also creates possibility. The possibility that what is not seen is not necessarily gone. The possibility that what is not understood is not necessarily unknowable. The possibility that the silence itself carries meaning, even if that meaning is not immediately clear. In the end, the question does not disappear. It does not resolve into a single answer. It remains, not as a problem, but as a presence of its own, as a quiet reminder that something once shaped the path of humanity in ways that are still visible, even if they are no longer fully understood. And that whatever that something was, it has left behind just enough trace to ensure that the question will continue. Not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, existing within the silence, just as the silence exists within everything that followed.